Your hands together, bring out Stanton Friedman onto the audience, up the steps please. Right, there you go, take a seat. Oh, yes, tiring up here. Alright, now what a lot of people never really get a chance to do with Stanton Friedman is maybe ask the kind of questions that you like to ask. But you've got to understand that in the format of these kind of scenarios, it's actually difficult to create that. But I was a police interviewer of suspects and witnesses, and it's kind of my bag. Alright, so I like to see a little different side to the side that you normally see, just a bog standard lecture, forgive the phrase, but just a standard lecture. I want to bring these people to life in a slightly different way. So I want to talk about Stanton and his life and work. All right? So I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this because unfortunately
you can't see me.
Have a look at that. No. Very realistically. Now, as we've already said, you're 81 years old.
Yes.
Where were you born?
I was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, 18 miles from New York City. New Jersey is the most densely populated of all the states. It's all people, no land.
Okay, so am I right in thinking that you're a dual citizen, Canada and the USA?
Yes, it took a long time. Let me say why I moved to Canada. Because I just heard today a rumor that's apparently on this side of the pond that the FBI and CIA chased me out of the country. Nonsense. My wife was born in, or lived in New Brunswick, Canada. We were living in California. They passed a law in California because, would you believe, they had a surplus in the state budget? Impossible to believe. But
it is easy, isn't it?
And they were raising the tax rates. And so people whose little house they retired in, suddenly their tax bill is gone through the ceiling. And in California, they put things on the ballot. Okay? So they passed Prop 13 to limit the increase in the sales tax, property tax, until the house got sold. Okay? To 1% a year, instead of like 20 or 30% a year. And it won, which was fine. It helped me on my property tax, but many of the junior colleges where I spoke in California were getting their money from the property tax. And suddenly they didn't have budgets for speakers. So I was having to go back east. It cost a lot of money to go back east. And we were visiting my wife's family every summer. Lots of family back there, 5 siblings of hers and her parents, and nieces and nephews and cousins. We finally decided we don't have any family in California. And the property had doubled, tripled in value in 5 years. We can buy a house back there for half of what we're paying here.
So it made economic sense, I guess.
It made economic sense and practical sense. When I was out of town, I knew there was a support system for my wife.
Okay.
Her sisters and their husbands.
Yeah, support structure. Yeah, no, that's
all that. I've never, this may sound strange to some people who think of California as a wonderful place, and it is, but it's got its problems. I've never regretted the move in 35 years.
Okay.
Come visit Fredericton, New Brunswick. I don't recommend the winter time. Last winter we had 4 feet of snow on the grass all winter long. I say grass, I didn't see any grass. But it had nothing to do with the FBI or the CIA. And only 73 miles from beautiful downtown Holton, Maine, where I have a post office box.
Okay.
So there was nothing nefarious about that.
Okay, well you've answered that clear. I haven't been aware of that one. What I want to talk about though is kind of go over your life in the sense of some of the notable things. Now, we know that you're a nuclear physicist. Talk me through your degrees, I think 1955, 1956.
Yes, I went to Linden High School in Linden, New Jersey. I got accepted at MIT, but I couldn't afford to go there. The tuition was $950 a year. It's $25,000 now, but you know. So I went to Rutgers University, the State University of New Jersey, Went there for 2 years and switched to the University of Chicago,
Okay.
which had the first nuclear chain reacting pile, Enrico Fermi and people like that.
Okay.
I worked my way through college. I was a busboy in the Catskill Mountains in New York.
Okay.
Then I got a job as a union waiter at a good restaurant in Chicago. I made more money as a waiter than I would have working in the physics department over at the Research Institute. And I learned a lot about food. I couldn't afford to buy it. I got stuff I was selling, you know. And I got a job. Spent 3 years at Chicago. Carl Sagan and I were classmates for 3 years. We're the same age. We grew up in adjacent towns in New Jersey. He's not with us anymore. But
Were you good friends?
we were, yeah, because it was a small group of students, a couple dozen. And we grew up in adjacent towns in New Jersey. We didn't know each other then, but
Oh, we'll maybe come back to Carl Sagan in a bit, because he obviously went on to have his own very prominent careers and stuff.
yeah. And I saw him a year before he died. I was at his home when I spoke at Cornell and so forth. And we had some disagreements, gentlemanly.
Yeah.
You understand. But I was fortunate, you might say. I graduated with the Depression babies.
Okay.
I was born in 1934. My high school class was the smallest in years, and it got bigger, which meant that you didn't have as much trouble finding a job, because there weren't many people on the market.
Yeah.
You were rare birds. So I got a job, and I thought, very foolishly, I guess, my dad worked for the same company for 37 years. Back then, if you got a job, you were loyal to the company and they were loyal to you. The Depression was a powerful influence on your shoulder. I thought I'd work for General Electric all my life. I figured out I could retire when I was 57. They had a planned age and years, you know.
That was kind of the generation where you could have a full lifetime working in the car industry.
That's what I thought. But in 3 years, my first job was very exciting. I was working on nuclear airplanes.
Nuclear aeroplanes, what's nuclear aeroplane?
Well, you use a nuclear power plant to heat the air that came in. Instead of using burner cans with gasoline, jet fuel, you use a reactor to heat the air. And the advantage is you could go for thousands of hours without refueling. Unlimited range.
So what happened to nuclear powered aircraft?
Well, I had fun for 3 years doing radiation shielding experiments. And there's a point I want to make, and that is that our budget in 1958 was $100 million. We employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. Now, $100 million was a lot of money in 1958.
It's still a lot of money.
Well, okay, but you get the point. There are many people who think the only place research gets done is in academia, universities.
Yeah.
You know, 6 professors, 20 grad students, that's a big program. Our program
But in
was...
reality, it's not.
No, in reality, it's not. It's right. And I saw the handwriting on the wall. We didn't have any leadership in the program. General Electric owned the carpet on the boss's office floor, but it was just cost plus.
Okay.
You build and they pay, but there's no real incentive to get big.
Okay.
There was no leadership saying, we really want a nuclear-powered airplane. And so I got another job, and I told people when I left that I didn't think there'd be a project there in a year or two. 16 months later, it was canceled. And I was glad I got out before it was canceled.
Okay, now, can I just move something, because we're talking about something significant happens to you in 1958. Can you tell me what that is?
Oh, yeah. I was ordering books from a mail-order bookstore. My wife and I often did. I needed one more book so I wouldn't have to pay shipping. I'm a cheapskate. There was the report on UFOs from the guy who was the Air Force Project Blue Book director of that program. And it was $2.95 marked down to $1, which is what shipping costs would have been. Edward Ruppelt,
Yeah.
report on unidentified flying objects.
Fantastic.
The Air Force was a co-sponsor of our program, and as you know, it turned out that was a very good first book, because there were several I read later. If I'd read them first, I'd have never read another book about flying saucers. I read the book, It didn't convince me. It was free after all. I loaned it to a neighbor. I was 24 years old. The neighbor was 10 years older and a good engineer. He was more impressed than I was, and that impressed me. Because I respected Charlie.
Okay.
10 years later, I saw him for the first time. I was given to talk to a bunch of electrical engineers. First thing he said was, "We knew you when you didn't believe in flying stuff." That was comforting to me.
That's a long time ago.
And so I moved to California, read 10 more books, had a good librarian. And the epiphany came when at the University of California, Berkeley Library, I found Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14. The largest study ever done for the United States Air Force. And it was remarkable because it wasn't mentioned in any of the books that I read. And I'm a data hound, like you. I want evidence, facts, tables, charts, maps, etc. And the guy who put this together, a privately published version, included the press release. Quoting the Secretary of the Air Force, he made the following statement: "On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena if more complete observational data had been available." Now, the only trouble with that statement is I had the report. It was a total lie. I don't like being lied to by people like the Secretary of the Air Force. If you look at the facts in the report, the unknowns were 21.5%. That's not 3 rounded off. And they also found the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unidentifiable. They also did a cross-comparison between the unknowns, the only ones we're interested in, and the knowns. 6 different characteristics they looked at. They found that the probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. So I got angry. Not only because I didn't like being lied to, but I wanted to get at the facts. So I joined APRO and NICAP, the 2 old groups, got their newsletters, and was trying to get closer to the bottom of the truth. And then Frank Edwards did something that was important to me. I don't know how many of you have read Frank Edwards' book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business. It was a bestseller.
Yeah, I've got a copy. It's out there if you want to look for it, especially eBay, Amazon, those kind of things. You can still get that book. Very old book, but brilliant.
He was a journalist in Indianapolis, and I changed jobs again because a contract got canceled and wound up in Indianapolis, General Motors, Allison division. And I got in touch with Frank, and that program folded, and so I went to Pittsburgh, working for Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab, and I called Frank and I said, "Frank, you know everybody." He was a journalist. "Give me some names in Pittsburgh here. I want to go public." So he gave me some names, and one of them was the producer of a program called Contact, would you believe? For the biggest TV station in town and radio station. And I thought, being a Westinghouse nuclear physicist, that should be worth a fortune in Pittsburgh. I mean, if you want a loan, how much do you want, Mr. Friedman? You know, your credit's good. And the response was, "Don't call us, we'll call you." Less than a month later, they called me. "Could you be on our show at 7 o'clock? It was 6:30. And I lived not too far from the station. Somebody had canceled. And I have no idea how many people they called before they got to somebody who said, "Yes, I can do it." That was my first public exposure. I wasn't as good handling the nasty, noisy negativists as I am now, but somebody at work at Westinghouse heard me, wanted me to speak to her book review club. They were reviewing Frank's book. That got me started. I did a number of those talks. I was learning my trade. I went into work one time with somebody whose husband was the dean at Carnegie Mellon University. I said, "Jay, I'd like to speak there." "Well, did you talk to the dean?" "I didn't know he was the dean at the time." "No, I talked to Dr. So-and-so, he wasn't interested." He said, "Stan, he's heard you on the radio." Call him. So I did. He booked me. Except it was during the day and I'd have to take time off work. How much do you want? $100? I figured he'd knock me down to 50. He bought me at 100. Because I knew his wife, he told me what he was paying the other speakers in the series. 1,500, 1,700. Wow. Well, the talk went very well. He wrote the agent through whom he had booked those people, and he booked me at a keynote talk for me. Engineering Society of Detroit.
Okay.
$300 in expenses. They were sold out for 1,008 people for dinner and a talk. 3 weeks in advance.
1,008 people.
Yeah, I remember that because it stuck with me. And there wasn't one negative question. Now, even though I buy Japanese cars, I had to respect the Engineering Society of Detroit. And that got me rolling on trying to talk to big groups of professional people.
Yep.
Another talk was Los Alamos called me. They were working on nuclear rockets. I was working for Westinghouse on nuclear rocket engines. We tested them. We didn't just talk about them. How about talking to our local American Nuclear Society group, he said. I said, sure, I'd love to. No, I mean on an expense account. I said, well, I don't make those decisions. Ask management. They paid for me to go from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Los Alamos, New Mexico to give a lecture, Flying Saucers Are Real, to the American Nuclear Society chapter there. We had 500 people, not one negative question.
What year would this be?
This would have been 67, 68.
Okay.
So when I got laid off, we had a very successful nuclear rocket engine test. And they canceled the program. And I got a job, I thought, to do the best job I could have imagined. McDonnell Douglas knew the boss man, did an interview, and they hired me to try to figure out how flying saucers work.
Okay. So they were taking it seriously?
What?
So they were taking it seriously, the concept?
Oh, this guy was taking it very seriously, yeah. And I was really looking forward to it. I'm driving across the country. The money came from the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program,
Okay.
which was a big program.
Yeah.
And I hear on the radio, driving across the country, that they just canceled the program. I walk in, she says, you know, we just laid off 5,000 people. Yeah, I know. They kept me for 3 months, but that determined I was going to have to look out for me,
Okay.
getting lectures and all the rest of that stuff. And I've been at it ever since. Doing mailing to 1,000 colleges back then when I was young.
So you say that 1958 was when you began to open?
So I read my first book was 58. First lecture was in 67.
Right, so in a sense from a lecturing point of view, 67.
67, yes.
Which is, 33, 48 years ago.
Yeah.
48 years ago.
The Grandma Moses
Can you
of the
imagine
book
that?
trade.
48 years ago.
Yeah,
48 years of lecturing. And how many countries have you lectured in?
18.
18, okay.
And 50 states and 10 provinces.
Now yesterday in the car when I picked you up from the airport, we had this great little conversation and I asked you a few questions. And you mentioned a little anecdote about the Fermi paradox, which I thought the audience would really, because you knew Fermi.
Well, I knew of him and I heard him lecture.
Well,
He was one of the reasons I went to the University of Chicago.
Can you tell me what you told me and put it in the context about the phrase that has become famous? You know?
Well, Enrico Fermi was a great scientist, and if you could have heard the other professors talk about him when he died, I was there in Chicago when he died, incredible respect from other guys who were not small guys either.
Okay.
The Fermi paradox is what's called when Fermi and other important scientists at Los Alamos had lunch and had a discussion about how long would it take to colonize the entire galaxy. You know, a theoretical question, obviously, but they talked about it. Figured it would only take a few million years, which isn't very long compared to the history of the galaxy. And as they were leaving, Fermi said, so where is everybody? And they all knew what he was talking about. He didn't say, how come there's nobody coming here? And he was famous on campus for asking questions as a teaching tool. You know, the sky is blue, derive this law of physics from that kind of thing. And The answer I give to the question is, we don't know where everybody is, but we know some of them have been coming here, and the government knows all about it, and they're not telling us. That's my answer. Remember, Fermi, unlike most academics, had a very high-level security clearance. He knew the government could keep secrets. The first nuclear chain reaction was done by him on a squash court under Stagg Field, in secret, at the University of Chicago. He knew about secrecy. He worked on the atom bomb. And Los Alamos was the place. It was a secret city. Nobody knew it existed. They got their mail in a post office box in Santa Fe. Nobel Prize winner. Fermi was a Nobel Prize winner. And there's an irony here. When they went to get his Nobel Prize in like 1938, they stopped in Oslo. They lived in Italy. But Mussolini was becoming like Hitler and prosecuting the Jews, and his wife Laura was Jewish. So they went from Oslo to the United States and never went back to Italy.
Okay.
There are a lot of the scientists who worked on the atomic bomb who would have remained in Europe if Hitler hadn't been so anti-Semitic.
Yep.
And so it's kind of ironic. And so Fermi was a great scientist. He raised a legitimate question, you know, where are the aliens if they're out there? And the answer is there's loads of them around. And I say, my 4 conclusions, let me be clear about this. I don't shilly-shally. 1, the evidence is overwhelming. Planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underline 27 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. I don't care about them. The basketball coach doesn't care about the 98% of the people that aren't 7 feet tall. Give me the one who is. Heck with the rest, you know. The second conclusion is we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate, meaning some few people in major governments have known since at least 1947 that some UFOs are alien spacecraft. You don't keep secrets by telling everybody and hoping nobody talks. I worked under security for 14 years. The third conclusion is there are no good arguments against the first 2 conclusions. And the fourth conclusion is we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. I say 2 millennia, and then I get into religious arguments, and I don't deal with those at this point. So I have been speaking out for all those years, and I've only had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk. And the audience took care of the others. So I say this to encourage people. I'm giving a paper next week, how to make ufology respectable.
Okay, very fascinating.
And one of them is don't be an apologist ufologist.
Absolutely.
Don't be afraid to speak out. Be like this man over to my right. Have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. Basic rule of police work.
Absolutely.
And of ufology, it should be.
Of course it should be. Now, one of the things that has always fascinated me is you came from a very accomplished scientific background. You know, you worked for major businesses, engineering companies. Now, when you suddenly began to openly talk about UFOs, and you'd already formed the opinion that some UFOs were extraterrestrial, what was the attitude of your colleagues?
I never had a hard time from them. They came to my lectures. What can I say? I don't know what they were saying behind my back.
Yeah.
But the enthusiastic response of professional people, well, in Pittsburgh, I was asked to speak to a joint meeting of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics and the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. They had a joint
That's
meeting.
not easy to say.
Sorry. And I thought I had really laid an egg because we had a dinner first. There were 20 people to dinner across the street from where I was speaking. Boy, I told them it'd be a big crowd. We go across the street and the auditorium was already half full and we wound up with 400 people. And the janitor had to close the doors. It was a limit. My boss's boss's boss was there.
Okay.
And a lot of other professional people there, not surprising with those 2 groups. And I asked at my company, Westinghouse, I said, I need some guidance. I enjoy all these lectures that I'm doing. I'm a ham. I'm a Leo. I like being on the stage. I will acknowledge it.
I would have never guessed.
Oh, yeah, I'm such a shy retiring kind of guy, yeah. So I asked my boss for some guidance. I don't want to lose my job. I got a family to feed. I don't want to lose my security clearance. But I couldn't get another job if I didn't have one doing what I was doing. So they came back to me with three rules. You can say what you please on your time. You can identify yourself as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist. But we'd like you to start with a disclaimer that the views you're about to hear are mine and mine alone and not those of my employer. Fair enough. But then I asked for one more thing when the Los Alamos guy asked me to speak to the American Nuclear Society chapter. I mean, I am a member of the American Nuclear Society and they're a corporate member of Westinghouse, but still, they didn't have to pay my way.
Yeah.
They could have said, look, you can go and give the lecture, but put down as the purpose of the trip technical discussions.
Yeah.
The guy who asked me was also doing the same kind of work I was doing, radiation chilling for reactors and so forth. But they played it straight. So I've always been grateful for that, and that meant I must have convinced somebody that it was okay.
Do you not find that, in a sense, this is almost a paradox, that in a sense you were dealing with academia and not getting a hard time? Obviously you knew from your scientific background that you knew what you were doing, you knew your subjects, you had facts and figures that you could bounce back. But the fact that your peers, at least publicly or behind your back, were not criticising you, were not able
It was very important to me. I respected their opinion.
But in a sense that speaks volumes to me about what is wrong with the last 60 years of suppression of this subject. Because if those scientific people with similar credentials as you, kind of like accepting and warmly inviting you to give presentations, really, it just makes me think how many thousands, if not millions of scientists who would love to get involved in this subject if the climate of fear and ridicule was different.
Well, that's certainly true. The kicker here was that usually when I spoke at a college, I've spoken at more than 700 colleges and universities and so forth. It's usually the student activities people who talk to me. It's not the academics.
Okay.
Now, sometimes I always offer to appear in classes on campus to help promote the lecture.
Yeah.
And I find out from the students that sometimes the physics department will have me in because Dr. So-and-so thinks this is a bunch of baloney and he's going to show me off as being an idiot. And I've enjoyed those events. Well, I have a standard technique. I would go to the board and talk about things I knew they didn't know anything about, like the electromagnetic submarine, like the nuclear rocket engine, stuff like that. Put some sketches on the board. You're all aware of this, aren't you? And of course, none of them are.
So you got them at a disadvantage straight away by making them feel that they didn't know. Yeah.
Well, I also did a couple of other things. I asked them, what's the numerical value of 1g, the acceleration of gravity at the surface right here, and 9.8 meters per second squared. I said, well, how about putting that in useful units? And they look at me like I'm talking Swahili.
You're talking Swahili to me.
That's 21 miles per hour per second.
Okay.
That's, if I drop something here, that's the rate at which it accelerates.
Okay.
And then I asked them, what's the speed of light? 186,000 miles a second. Again, that's not a unit anybody uses for measuring anything.
No.
670 million miles an hour in good English.
In layman's terms.
But then I asked them, this is a multiple choice question. How long does it take at 1g to get to the speed of light? It's multiple choice. 1,000 years, 100 years, 10 years, 1 year. How many think it's 1,000? How many think it's 100? How many think it's 10? How many think it's 1? You'd be amazed at how many think it's 1,000 or 100 or 10. They're right. 1.
Really?
1 year at 1g to get close to the speed of light. And I do this because I want the students to know that their professors don't know what the hell is going on. And so I can take advantage, in other words, of the fact that I know how ignorant they are. I do something else. I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies in my lecture.
Tell me about them. Tell me the 5 studies.
Project Blue Book Special Report 14. We've already talked about that. 3,201 sightings, 200 charts, tables, graphs, maps, etc. The second one is the congressional hearings of 1968. Testimony from 12 scientists. I was one of them, and I'm the only one who's still alive because I was the youngest and the only one without a PhD. Those things. Some excellent papers. Dr. J. Allen Hynek's book, The UFO Experience. He was only the Air Force consultant for 20 years on UFOs. And it's funny how the anti-UFO astronomers never talk about his book.
Yeah.
That's par for the course. There was Dick Hall's book, The UFO Evidence.
64, yeah.
And the University of Colorado study,
68.
which, according to a special UFO subcommittee of the world's largest group of space scientists, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, 30% of the 117 cases studied in detail could not be identified.
How many percent?
30%.
30. So we're not talking 3%, 30%.
Yeah.
Think about this.
And this comes from a special committee set up by the world's largest group of space scientists. It's not the local UFO group. You know. So, and after talking about each of these, I asked how many people here have read it. I'm lucky if it's 1 or 2% have read any of those.
Yeah.
So that you might say, I'm being nasty to do this because I might embarrass somebody. But what do I care?
Absolutely. You're proving your point with evidence.
I'll give you an example. I spoke at the Gulf Research Management Club in Pittsburgh. Professional people, dinner and talk. As soon as I started, somebody interrupted. How about talking about blah, blah, blah? And I said, I'll talk about that later. And the second time, the third time, finally the boss man says, hey, let him finish. Okay, so I finished. And this guy raised his hand, the question and answer period. Well, I'm sure one could come to other conclusions than the ones you've come to, he says. I say, let me see if I've got this straight. You hadn't read any of those 5 large-scale scientific studies, had you? Because you can remember a few people who had. Well, no. I said, well, very politely, that's the difference between us, isn't it? I gave you my conclusions. I gave you the sources on which I based those conclusions. I've read them all. You've read none of them. Whose opinion's worth more? Long silence. Well, why should I play games? Why should I give a platform to somebody who hasn't looked at the evidence?
Absolutely. I agree with you, Tom.
So, and also, it keeps down the number of people who start asking questions who don't know anything about the subject. It's not the asking questions, it's the making proclamations.
Yes.
There's a difference between investigation and proclamation, as you, as a police officer, know.
Absolutely. And this is, again, one of my pet hates, but it's, the world is dominated, this subject is dominated by the media and the way the mainstream media allow, there is no, I mentioned this yesterday, one of the frustrating things for me is, if it was a political debate in Britain, you'd have a top political commentator on Newsnight saying, okay, you said that in 1978 with the Labour Party. Oh no, you can't say that because you said that at the conference in 2006. You'd have a referee, an arbiter, who was an expert in the subject. Unfortunately, in the media, we do not have referees who know anything about this subject. So if you know nothing about this subject other than what people make these bland proclamations, it's the blind leading the blind. And you must begin to realise, if you're not already aware, that this is what happens with mainstream, with every documentary that's made, or virtually every documentary that's made. It's researchers coming in, it's just another job. A little bit of research, yeah, we'll get that person, yeah, they'll work to the little agenda, and it follows a predictable pattern. They're not after the truth, they're after entertainment. Their agenda is not the truth most of the time. Would you agree with that, Stan?
I agree with that. Yeah.
Now, I just want to move things slightly in a different direction, because with your background, and because you knew very eminent people within this field, talk about the 68 hearings. Did you have involvement in that?
I presented only on paper. 6 scientists testified in person. 6 more of us in writing only.
Okay, and what was your paper on the 68?
I made the case for some UFOs as alien spacecraft. I included Special Report 14. I did it in the question and answer format and asked questions like, well, you can't get here from there, can you? And I went into how you could get here from there with fission rockets, fusion rockets.
And what was the response from the people who were effectively running that debate?
Well, I wasn't there in person, see, I was submitted. I never had a bad comment from anybody about my paper.
Okay, so 1968 you're already submitting at the very highest level of the subject. And I think twice at the United Nations, is that right?
Twice at the United Nations.
Tell me about the United Nations.
Well, there were hearings set up that included people like Alan Hynek, people like Gordon Cooper, astronaut, a number of other, James E. McDonald, people like that. And the General Assembly responded extremely well. But the United States put the kibosh on a motion. This was initiated by the guy from
Grenada.
Yeah. Can't remember his name. I'm getting old. And nothing really came out of that.
Geary. That was the...
Geary, yes. Yeah. But the response was great there. I'm not a person who is looking for punishment from people out there.
Yeah.
I've always had a good response. You know, I don't do this to get slings and arrows of outraged debunkers.
Well, this time, you, in a sense, you were with eminent people in the physical sense. It just wasn't a written submission. You were there. But
I wasn't there.
So at the United Nations.
Oh, I was at the United Nations, yes.
But it doesn't seem to have had any effect. Why do you think that one?
Because of the press, in a sense, strange thing to say, the news coverage went to the murder of a gay city councilman in San Francisco who had come from New York.
Okay.
And that's what got the headlines. Geary wasn't supposed to be at the press conference, but he was.
Okay.
And I was glad that some of his comments didn't get wider distribution.
Okay.
So there wasn't a lot of publicity given to it because it was more publicity. Don't ask me to explain what San Francisco got to do with, what was going on in New York. But it had a lot to do with what's the big story of the day, who got killed this week.
Absolutely.
The United States, who got killed this day. We have more murders than you have per capita, I understand.
Okay, so again, you've met when all, I would imagine most of the people in the audience here have read books on UFOs, but you're actually the guy who, knew McDonald.
Oh, I knew James E. McDonald, yes.
Fantastic guy, died
yes.
Much too early, mysterious,
yes.
a lot of people think. Hynek, what were your thoughts on Hynek? Because I find Hynek a frustrating figure in the sense of, by the time he'd made Close Encounters of the Third Kind as a consultant, he was kind of like the hero, but really he'd been a debunking specialist for many, many years.
The swamp gas specialist, remember?
Yeah, well, that kind of did his leg really, didn't it? Because he was so legal.
Alan was an interesting man. Also, he had a PhD from the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
When I was still working in industry, I wanted to visit him because I was going to be speaking in Chicago.
Yeah.
Well, when I checked, I had to be vetted by a colleague of his from the University of Chicago who had come to my lecture and decide whether it was okay for him to take me up to see Alan.
Okay.
He came to the lecture. He was surprised that I knew some of the things that I knew. I went to see Alan, and his first question was, why didn't you get your PhD? And I said, because I've been working my way through college for 5 years, and I want to get out in the real world.
Yeah.
In the United States at that time, you had to worry about the draft.
Yes, yeah.
And I was prime meat, because you could finish your college program, but then you'd have to go in unless you got a job that you were needed for the war effort. There's always a war in the United States.
Tell me about it. Yeah.
So, I worked my way through school, and I worked in projects that had a military implication. Nuclear airplanes, that would be for the Air Force.
Whereas defense interest made you
Yeah.
for the industry.
Yeah. So I liked Alan as a person. He was a nice person. He wouldn't look at the data on interstellar travel, referred to a big bibliography of 2,000 references. He'd never look at that.
Okay.
And he was afraid to speak out. He was fearful of risking his reputation. McDonald was just the opposite.
Absolutely, he was a hero of mine.
He was a hero of mine.
Because, again, people like Kehoe, they just said it how they felt, which is what you do, and I take great inspiration of your work, in the sense of, if you passionately believe something, and what you said right at the start is, don't be an apologist, ufologist. It's absolutely true. If you really believe, then you tell your friends, you tell everybody, and don't be embarrassed, because they're the ones wearing blinkers, and not you. Your eyes and blinkers have been ruined.
Alan didn't do his homework about interstellar travel. Very few astronomers do. And he used to use
Isn't that a contradiction in terms, astronomers? No?
Astronomers think they know everything about the universe, after all. That's their concern. They don't need to do any homework, and they certainly don't want to do anything that's being done in industry. Industry is a bad word when you're in academia. Oh, yes. Just an engineer, they'll say. Stuff
Just
like
an engineer. Yeah.
And Alan used to use the strange analogy. If the distance to the moon is, let's say, 1 mile, then the distance to the nearest star is umpteen billion miles, and as if it was linear, twice as far, twice as long. Space travel is not linear. If you could double your velocity at burnout when you go to the moon, you'd get there 20 times faster.
Okay.
It's like profit, the difference between costs and sales.
So in a sense, he was highly prominent, obviously, the public figure of Project Blue book in terms of the astronomer, etc. So he was given a lot of airtime by the mainstream. I mean, he could shake people by throwing these things out that really didn't have any substance. But the audience were only wiser because they didn't have the technical background to know what he was talking about.
And he wasn't willing to respond. I was there at the University of California, Los Angeles, when he spoke. And the guy who introduced him said all kinds of nasty things about UFOs. And he didn't say boo. I would have immediately responded, you know.
And hence, in a sense, I'm going to move away from mining. But for me, he's a flawed character in terms of ufology, because he's not the hero that he's painted to be. He was very flawed, and he played the Air Force game for many, many years.
Yes.
He bumped many pilots and became part of the system that was covering this up. You couldn't have done that. I couldn't have done that. It makes me wonder how some of these people do that. As if somebody says, will you do that for us? Because we don't really want to.
Well, he liked his job as a consultant to the Air Force, and he once said, well, he's got his son in college, so he's got to keep earning.
So again, the truth might just go out the window.
That's right.
Which I couldn't do that. But there you go. Now,
Well, let me tell you one more thing. I'll be talking tomorrow about the Bollinger memo.
yeah, very famous.
When I gave Alan a copy of that, his first copy, they used us. He read it and came back to me. They used us. He finally realized that he hadn't been getting the good stuff.
Okay.
He didn't know up to that point in time, and he should have known.
That's right. And everybody in this room should be aware of the Bollinger memo. And he basically said the Air Force regulations, the best cases would not be in the system. Okay?
I'll quote from it tomorrow.
That's basically what he said. It circumvented Project Blue Book. So everybody goes on about Project Blue Book, Project Blue Book. It was really the public relations exercise. It was a front, a kid not too far away from the MOD desk with Nick Corbrand. He was a very low level admin officer. He rose up quite well, but not doing UFO. When he was at the desk, he was a very low ranking civil servant. And he ran it for 3 years, but he was one person. Yes, he had access to a couple of radar things and things like that. But in a sense, he is not anybody like Stanton with his background. Because he's really been there, he's got the academic credentials, and he knows the difference between facts and hearsay and evidence. So I just want to make that clear distinction. There is this, confusion that people don't realise. Okay, Karen. Right, okay. Now, from my point of view, how many books have you written?
I co-authored 3, authored 2.
Okay, you working on any more books?
I'll tell you after next week. I've done 2 books with Kathleen Martin,
Yeah.
who is Betty Hill's niece from the famous Betty and Barney Hill story. A fine writer, and we're talking about another one. And we'll probably decide next week whether we go ahead with one. Our publisher wants one, but it's a lot of work for this old man.
Oh. Maybe a personal question, but do you find yourself having to slow down now?
Well, my memory isn't as good as it used to be.
Seems pretty good to me.
Well, you're talking about what happened 5 years ago. I worry about what happened 5 days ago.
Well, from my point of view, all I can say is that you've done an amazing job. And I really don't know of anybody who comes anywhere near you. I think McDonald, personally, had he have lived, could have had a major influence.
Oh, no question about that. I knew Jim.
Tell me a little bit about him.
He was a go-getter. He was a professor of physics at the University of Arizona, but his specialty was atmospheric physics. And most UFOs are seen in the atmosphere, obviously, so it's kind of an important skill. And he talked to over 500 witnesses. He was a damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead kind of guy. And when he ran into people like Dr. Donald Menzel of Harvard University, or Philip Klass, who had no class, but pardon me.
That's another story.
Yeah, he did detailed scientific critiques of their explanations.
Yeah.
And Jim went for it. He talked to the famous RB-47 case.
Yeah, yeah.
A highly trained crew in a military reconnaissance plane loaded with fancy gear, which had a sighting lasted for an hour. They saw it visually, they picked it up on their radar, they called the ground military, they picked the 2 targets up on the screen, and this lasted for an hour. Jim found all the crew members and talked to every single one of them. That's the kind of guy he was. And what shocked him is when he got a look at the Air Force files, there were so many good cases where the explanations didn't match the data.
Absolutely.
That got him.
Which is a lot of it down to Hynek, part of that, and allowing this debunking program to go ahead.
The Air Force didn't do its job. But we know why. As Bollinger said, reports which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146, Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. Even though the Air Force has been saying Blue Book was it for all that time. So the good stuff didn't go there. Jim pulled out some of the better stuff, but nobody was paying attention. Nobody cared whether they were looking at the good stuff.
Just in relation to McDonald, are you suspicious of his death?
Well, I did something I normally wouldn't have done. When I heard about his death, I was getting calls. You're next, Stan. They took out Jim. That makes you a little worried. So I did something I normally wouldn't have done. I talked to his daughter and his wife about what happened to him. Well, it turned out he had tried suicide. He got depressed frequently, and his wife had told him there was a new man in her life, which sort of didn't go over very well. Let's put it that way.
Understandable.
And he shot himself and only succeeded in blinding himself.
Okay.
And then they found his notes a few months later. He committed suicide. And I talked to his daughter. I wouldn't normally ask somebody about something like this, but I needed to stop the rumors, you know. And his daughter said they found his notes. He was a very meticulous guy. I was the first guy to see his file. Incredibly careful, and he had a secretary and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, they found his notes, what he planned to do. And he had taken a taxi on a Saturday to a gun shop in Tucson, where you can buy guns all over the place. Bought a gun, and got another taxi, took him out to the desert, and he finished the job. And I had talked to a colleague at the University of Arizona. who he was very well liked, and who also, there was no question that he had tried to kill himself when he blinded himself that time. So I was satisfied from talking to two people who should know better than anybody, his wife and his daughter.
Absolutely. But again, that kind of shows the person you are. Again, you knew him, and because you respected him, you kind of wanted to know the truth.
Yes.
You got the truth. So I think for the first time in the audience, a lot of people have got first-hand knowledge of somebody who actually did the research with the family members. So hopefully it does lay that ghost to rest.
I hope so.
Okay. Now, time, I could talk all day with you, I really could. And I'd love to do that. But unfortunately, time is our greatest element. Now, from somebody who went from science and academia, who has got a tremendous track record in industry, who took the brave leap into the unknown, and began lecturing in a subject that we're all crazy about, in the sense that we believe by mainstream to be crazy. I just have to take my hands off to you, and I want to pay tribute to you. So I want to give you a Lifetime Achievement Award for your work, and if you just come on to here. This is not an award ceremony, by the way. Stand up, please.
From Truth Magazine, you read it, I have trouble with it. I see my name down the bottom. Okay. Proudly presents a Lifetime Achievement Award to Stanton T. Friedman, Canada, in recognition of your many years of service to ufology, 2015. Truth Magazine. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Right, there you go. Did you see a slightly different side to Stanton that he never normally gets asked? This guy deserves a Lifetime Achievement Award. One more round of applause, please.